1400 years ere seed sown. Truth was twisted, its seeds were grown. Break the lies, spark the mission. Welcome to Quranic Inquisition.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Peace of the Lord to all of you. And shalom, assalamu alaikum, namaste, and all other peaceful greetings of your land. Welcome to this new show where we're going to be talking about something quite fun. And with us, as always, Cash. Hello, Cash. How are you doing today?
Hi JC, I'm doing really well. How about you?
I'm really good. Are you looking forward to this fun topic?
Yes, very much so. It's quite a serious topic, but also it's a little lighthearted because we are discussing at the baseline from the standard Islamic narrative something that reads quite strange, which is the verse about we being us humans being created from a spurting liquid that comes from between the backbone or the loin is also rendering, and the ribs. So something quite silly feeling, and it's often brought up in apologetics and polemics in regards to embryological failures or scientific errors. And this is some discussion that comes up every now and then to discuss this verse according to the standard Islamic narrative. What we want to do is have a look at it without considering the standard Islamic narrative.
Right. So what you're saying is that we are not created from a liquid that that flows from between the backbone and the ribs.
I know it's hard to believe, but the text may have not originally said that. Because although
Wow.
it's a very brilliant statement, um, it may have been too brilliant.
Well, mind blown. Well, let's see what we find.
So this is the specific verses. I got this image just from Quran.com, where we can see that this is the Da'if International or Sahih International translation that we will be looking at here. What we read in the English translation from Da'if International is he was created. He in this context is referring to mankind, so man as a abstract plural, mankind as such, that we were created from a fluid ejected emerging from beneath, or rather, sorry, between the backbone and the ribs. So that's what we were just talking about. This is these are the two verses here in question, where it appears on Sin translation, or just sort of the standard way we interpret according to the Arabic, quote unquote. Um, it results in something that's quite strange, which is that we were created from some liquid between two bone structures or whatnot. So this is the root that we're looking at. You can see at the very bottom, the 86, sorry, 86 there at the very bottom, sulbi. This is what we then get translated as backbone in our translation. And what you will see very, very, very quickly, if you just look at the vast majority of these cases where we see it in the verb form, we see that it is translated consistently as crucify, be crucified, to crucify you, and so forth. However, when we see this root, the same root, in noun form at the bottom, we see it in the form in 86. It has just the straight basic noun form of sulbi, so just the root consonants with the definite article. So this would logically read, I would say, as either the crucifixion or the cross. Those would be the natural ways to render that. However, what we get from the standard translations is out of left field, we get backbone. So we also get loins. Same form essentially, it's slightly differently rendered because it also is it's rendering essentially kum, as well as an additional aleph appears also there in the Arabic of Surah 423. So this is the verses that we're going to be looking at. I have the murad here for the verses, all of them that we have
Cash,
attested.
just before you
Yep.
move on, can you just go back to the previous to this slide and can you explain to people what is this website, because this is not our doing, like why we're using this website and what does it mean when it's showing the information in this manner, so that they understand a little bit that this is not our doing, this is actually their doing, and so on.
Right, I should have mentioned that, yeah. So this website is corpus.quran.com. And this website is a very good resource to use for looking for congruences. because you can identify a word in a verse, and then you can click on a hyperlink of the word, and it'll show you all occurrences with all conjugations of any given root. So what we're seeing here are the 8 total cases of this root appearing in the entire Quranic text. So it'll give us essentially what it does is gives us an ability to very quickly see all occurrences, all contexts, all verses where we see this root used. So we're not going to go through in detail of all these instances, just to show here generally the context in regards to how the solidify is used. This is solidify is from Murad. That's how he renders what we see rendered in the Sin translations as crucify. Here we see another one. It's either essentially in the context of these verses, we either are talking about Jesus or we're talking about Pharaoh. It's not that important, but here we can see the Pharaoh said, "Believe by him, I give orality to you. Surely this is indeed a scheme which you have schemed in the city to bring its eligibles out from it. Eventually you will know." And then we have the punishment, which is a historical inaccuracy from the get-go, because crucifixion was not invented at the time of Pharaoh, and this is brought up many times, but for the sake of this presentation, we're not going to focus in on that, historical anachronism. So the
Yes.
times
So
when we
so these things that you are showing now, they are the ones that on the previous slide from Corpus Quran, they are the ones that are crucifixion, crucifixion, crucifixion throughout the book before it changes the meaning, right?
Yes, so the verses we're just looking at very quickly, it's not that important me go into details. It's just about showing you that way you can also pause the video and read the Murad translations for these verses in question here. Um, it's consistently and very clearly based on how it's, the context of how it's speaking about it. It's either about Isa or it's about Pharaoh, and it's about the actual act of crucifixion. Um, that's what we're seeing here in these verses. So I'm just going to take you through a couple more. We see again, it's in the context of Pharaoh again, talking about Musa and Aaron, and it's essentially making this claim that the Pharaoh was one of these people who would go out and crucify people, which makes sense, right? If you have Christ was crucified, so this crucifixion was something that was, let's say, in some sense, evil that was done to him. It's a terrible thing to enact crucifixion as such, and therefore it would make logical sense to apply that to Pharaoh. He's evil, he's a villain, so he crucifies people. Unfortunately, historically, that's inaccurate. So this is one of the 2 verses where we see the rendering of the root in question being rendered as loins in this instance by Corpus Quran. But before we look into the usage of solidness, as you see on the 3rd bottom line here in this slide, before we go there, I want to just mention suckled you, because so we have essentially this tradition. It's all over the place a little bit. In the hadiths, we see that there was meant to be a verse of suckling, and it was abrogated from the text, however, and the recitation. However, it was not abrogated from the law. A whole new bag of questions and all this. However, it's kind of worth taking a pause and just sort of realizing what we're even reading here, right? I'll read the full verse from Murad here, starting at 23. So we read, "Was prohibited over your mothers and your daughters and your sisters and your paternal aunts and your maternal aunts and the daughters of a brother and the daughters of a sister and the mothers who have suckled you." So in context, it's talking about those who are prohibited from presumably marriage, well, not presumably marriage and sexual relations. So these are the categories which are not allowed. And part of that category is, quote unquote, the mothers who have suckled you and sisters from suckling and the mothers of your women and so forth and so forth. So the idea effectively, this is the idea in the traditions, is that if you provide suckling to a stranger, a male stranger, then you have sort of recreated this mother and infant bond, that being the suckling relationship. So presumably now you're like kind of family through suckling, and therefore you're not allowed to have any more, sexual relations with such a person, which is kind of strange. All of a sudden, we're reading a religious text and we're talking about this completely embarrassing affair. So that's where my ears peak up, and I think silly or Syriac. And JC, what are your impressions generally about this whole suckling situation?
My impression is that whoever actually thought that it was a good idea to put that in a religious text, that's number one. But second, I think even in those days, they would know that suckling a woman's nipples is not what makes you lose interest in her. It's like that's the stories in the hadith that Muhammad says, well, if you do that, then, the guy is no longer interested because he's like your son. And it's like,
Right.
that's not how it works. So very
Freud
bizarre
enters Freud enters the room.
indeed.
um, you never expect the Spanish Inquisition or the Freud. Okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so to just not get sidetracked too much, I just want to touch on this suckling because it happens to be a verse we're dealing with here in context. So this word for suckling we see here in the manuscript. It is alif lam ra, and then we see a dad. That's what we're told. It's the dad character, as you can see there, with an ink that isn't the original inking, very clearly because of the lack of comparative erosion of the ink. You can see that a dot was added. This is a diacritic, and what it does is it turns the sad into a dad. My contention is that the original intent of the author was without a diacritic there, which would render it as a sad. So this is something that, of course, we take with a grain of salt. It's something that we can speculate upon, and I want to show you that speculation of what the word would essentially mean something entirely different if it was a sad or a tzade instead of a dad character. So this is just very quickly, that's what this word would mean. This is the raw tzade ein, if we see here, because after the tzade there's an ein. It's kind of hard to see, but if you see my cursor here, this is where the ein is, and then we have a marbuta, which can be either an H or a T. And looking just at the base root, we have this strong occurrence and attestation in regards to piercing, in the sense that this is a verb to pierce something or to bore something. It's used in the biblical Hebrew in a very key passage, which is talking about slavery or servitude. So this is the context in the Jewish tradition in regards to this root of piercing, and I'm going to present it that way we can offer another interpretation potentially instead of suckling, right? In Exodus 21:6, we read, "His master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever." It becomes a symbol of chosen servitude, a mark of love, loyalty, and obedience, because the ear is a symbolic of it's also used in other contexts of the Quran when we see the ear of God being spoken of, or things being done through the ear of God and so forth. That it symbolizes receptiveness, to have your ear to someone and so forth. You can see metaphorical meanings there. So it signifies obedience, loyalty, and so forth. The ear being the channel of the divine command. That's the Shema idea, right? O hear, O Israel, right? We hear and then we understand. So receptivity and obedience, loyalty is all through the ear. So there's that symbolism. And therefore, and we read in the Talmud, then this ear that heard, "You are my servants," and yet chose a human master, let it be pierced. So the idea of someone being pierced, or your relationship to them being one of a relationship of piercing, would suggest that this is talking about this kind of willing obedience and servitude to a master. So then if we look here, then instead of it saying those mothers, so it's talking about those who you're not allowed to have sexual relations with, right? So that's the context, that you're forbidden from relations with your mothers who have pierced you. So these are women who you are in servitude to because they pierced you, as well as sisters from piercing. So these are women who you have pierced, as in who you have as concubines and so forth. It's also important to note that concubinehood, as in the permissibility to have sex with your servants, your slaves, is something kind of touchy in the sense that there's attestations of it, being performed and practiced. However, in the 7th century, there was a shift away from that, in the sense that there was the understanding that the relationship of servitude, master servant, it's not appropriate to have sexuality in that dynamic. So they move away from that. So the Quranic text here would hence be saying something totally opposite from how it's eventually read, right? Because we all know that 424 is the verse that says that you're allowed to have women that your right hand owns. However, from what we've seen, it seems that the right hand possession idea in the Jewish understanding is more so that you take responsibility for them, so that they're not slaves, but instead the ones that are being the suckling ones, that is the actual category that's referring to slaves by proper means. So this essentially this interpretation would be saying that the whole suckling thing is not suckling, that instead it's about servitude, so these are actual slaves, and then it re-renders the whole right-hand possessions as being something that's not it's not a sly way of referring to slavery, because that is kind of a wild thing. Especially, personally, JC, what do you think? When I first found out that the text referred to slavery as like your right hand possessions, I thought that's over the line. As in, it's so crass to refer to reduce someone to a right hand possession. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think probably I will speak for the both of us, hopefully, that when we first read the Quran, we realized that there were many things that just didn't make sense. They don't fit um, a theological book, certainly not one in the Abrahamic faith, certainly not one 600 years after the time of Jesus, which, if anything, anybody created something, would be even more peaceful as opposed to actually doing a 180 and then having a religion based on Jesus that is very violent and all of those things. And we first saw everything as really weird, violent, some things like this very disturbing. And then as we are digging more and more, we realize that these things are just not in the book. When we see things that don't make any sense, is because that's what happened after they canonized the book. But now, by going back, the book is not as disturbing as it was when we first read it by using Daif International and all of these things. So the book is probably very peaceful and very calm and quite theologically rich, but we are still digging to find that. And when we see something like this, like talking about what you can do with your slaves and stuff, in the beginning, I thought, well, that's disturbing. That's not something that should be in a book or about God and these sort of things, not in the 600s. But now, all of my thoughts are, well, those things are probably not there. And somebody added diacritics and hamzas and alifs, and that's what it says now, but not what it did originally. Would you agree with that?
Most certainly. There's lots of tricks that were
Mm.
played essentially to get a different rendering. But specifically here, right, it's the question of, okay, either the verse in my rendering is saying no having sexual relations with slaves, and talking about right-hand possessions as being those who are under your protection and control, as in your subjects, essentially, right? Like that rendering, or you have a verse talking about suckling, as like you're not allowed to have relations with women who suckled you, and so forth, and then also talking about your right hand possessions as being the proper framing that how God refers to slavery, right? I would expect if it really was referring to slaves, you wouldn't have this kind of like interpretable, like it's open for interpretation, the idea of right hand possessions or that which your right hand owns. Yeah, you would, if you had something very clearly like abd, right? Why is it that the text refers to abd a lot, right? But when it comes to the question of are these right-hand possessions your slaves, it doesn't use a very clear language. It doesn't say, and of your abd, or those who are abd to you, right? It doesn't use clear language. Instead, we get this idea that slavery is condoned in the next verse after this one, because it talks about you can have relations with married women from what your right hand possesses. So it's hard to know exactly what right hand possesses. We're not going to go into that for the sake of this. Instead, we're going to have a look at what was really important about this verse when it comes to our topic, which is the next part where it says, so if you had not entered by them, then there was no misdemeanor over you, and the loose ones of your sons who are from your solidness. This is translated in Daif International and the other ones as from your loins, as in biological sons who are from your loins. And but however, like I said, when we were looking at the root, this is the same root as crucifixion or to crucify, and therefore the way I would render it is the logical one, which is that this is talking about not your solidness, but your cross. We speak in language nowadays as well when people say, Christ, well, every Christian says, pick up your cross. Well, Christ says, pick up your cross and follow me. So people have a cross, right? It's not that you only people who are crucified have a cross. It's also used metaphorically. So you could speak technically of someone saying, you know, my sons from the cross, and this could have the sense of your sons through religion, maybe your sons of your responsibility. So maybe those are all of those subject to your household and who you are responsible over. It's not totally sure. So that's the final verse that we're going to look at in terms of just the usage exhaustively of this in the Quran, and focus now on the one we really care about after this detour with the suckling thing, which is in Surah 86. So Surah 86 is actually quite a very cool surah now that I have figured it out in a sense. And this is the surah where we find the most straightforward, definite article base root form of the cross. So it's rendered by Murad as the solidness. I would put forward it's best to be rendered as the cross. However, without going too much forward, this is the verse we're going to look at. So to read the general gist of it, they have an introduction, which is not that important. So we're going to read starting verse 5. So let the human look from what was he created. So that's, like I said before, the question of the he in the next verse is about the human as such. So he, the human as such, was created from a spurting water. Then we read what kind of water this is, and or where it comes from. So the spurting water then goes out between the solidness, the SLB, and the turab. This is a word we're going to look at in a second. But what we have here is that human beings are created from a spurting liquid that comes out from between what we have currently tentatively rendered as the cross and something else. So there's an interesting image that's starting to build here, because if this is talking truly about the cross, then the question becomes, what's the other thing? And why between them? What are your thoughts so far, JC?
Well, first, actually, I think our friend Andrew has just joined. So, just to help him catch up, this word that Kash is explaining now, that Murad translates as solidness, in all of the other instances in the Quran, is about the crucifixion. So, Kash is now exploring. Okay, so why does it change the meaning all of a sudden when it gets here, when it's talking about creation? So that would be just like the summary of the last 20 minutes. Now, Kash, so now thinking about this when it says sparkling water, and I know that you have done some work and you think that it means something else, but if we have something about water before and then we're having crucifixion, I'm thinking whether it was a reference to baptism and being born again or something like that.
It is actually related to that. We'll see that in a second. Not exactly in the way you were presenting, but yet nonetheless, it is related to baptism. Um, because, like you said, with the whole idea of baptism to be born again, um, we'll see some verses in the New Testament in a second, which show what the image that's being painted here really is. So before we do that, let's have again a focus on the exact verse here. So we have it here in the Arabic in the top right, and the translations. We see that there's a fair, consistency about there's a fluid in question. It's coming gushing forth or ejecting. Yusuf Ali says he's created from a drop emitted. Similar enough. And the key thing here, I isolated this part here, which is min and then ma. I don't know how to pronounce that with the hamza, but the adding of the hamza here is what renders this as meaning water. However, like we always note, the hamzas are added roughly, 200 years or something like that after the original Quranic tradition is put to pen to paper. And therefore, it's the base assumption should start with is that the hamza is not helping us read the Quran, it's actually making it more difficult, it's confusing us when reading the Quran. And therefore, what we should do is render it without the hamza. And when it comes to the question of without the hamza, what does it mean then? Well, we check without the hamza form. Well, we basically just see in other instances where we have min ma. So here's just a couple examples. One in 86 verse 8. So just right after, actually, we see, well, that's the one we're dealing with, right? And then we see in other instances that's 6310. These are all from the Wettstein 1913 manuscript that you can find on corpusquranicum.de, if I recall correctly. Otherwise, you can just search that up. And we see that it's consistently used to mean what we see here in the Murad and how all the other translators render it as well, in these contexts where you don't have the Hamza is very simply min, which is sort of from, and then ma, meaning what. So it comes to mean from what. So therefore, before we fully render it, let's look at the root here to just confirm that it has good reason to be stable as having this general semantic scope. It has a more emphatic meaning in the Arabic to mean gush or pour out forcefully. And it's quite slightly different, but quite similar in the Syriac, which is simply to issue or to depart from something, to go out of. So something like a liquid leaving a container would be this root, right? And therefore, when we're looking at the proper rendering here, it should be created from what, and then this word here, which would then be this idea of going out, or let's just say gush, right? So it's a slight difference in the sense that it doesn't really change the general meaning. It simply says that the word for quote unquote water should be understood as just simply mean from what, as in it can be something that isn't water necessarily, just to make that clear. So that from now on, I'm just going to be rendering it as from what instead of from water ejected. So instead it reads from what ejected, and then the next verse from between the backbone and the rib cage. And this is the verse where we're looking at as well. And you can see there, this is the word here, up here, this is the cross word, al-salib. And then it says wa, and then this turab word, another word. So let's look at some manuscripts to see how this looks just on this is the Wettstein here, and this is the verse we see.
Just before we see that, just making a comment here from Andrew. So there's also a hadith about Mo showing the sparkling liquid on his hand to his men. Thank you very much for that image, Andrew. It's much appreciated. I think we know what these people actually thought that meant. Fortunately, the original probably meant something else, which is what Kash is now evidencing. But yes,
This is the
there are
genius.
hadiths that talk
This is
about
this
all
is
of
the
this.
genius. JC, this is the genius of what they did with these traditions, right? So when discussing like, oh wow, the text actually says something entirely different, right? We just get distracted by how embarrassing and how like outrageous these hadith traditions are. So then we bring that up and start discussing and laughing about how goofy this Muhammad of the Hijaz was, and despite the fact that we feel like we're mocking someone and therefore we're winning or whatever, we're getting totally distracted, right? I'm afraid I don't actually care that much what someone who never knew the fake person of history called Muhammad, like, I don't care what this person 200, 300, 400 years later writes about this fictional character in the Hijaz, right? It doesn't actually matter, right? So we should be focused on the text, although it is funny to mention that particular spurting liquid out of all the ones you could talk about. So to look at the manuscripts here, I just put under the characters the corresponding transliterated into the Latin script form. So we have Alif Lam, the definite article, and then we see this SLB. That's then this root in question for the crossing, crucifying, and this would therefore make it the definite article case of the base noun, so therefore the cross. And then we have the wa, meaning and. So we're talking about from this liquid between what, the cross, and this next word. So what we see that quite interesting about this next word here, if I zoom in here, you see that this is quite a peculiarity here, in the sense that the scribe would have presumably had to have written the aleph, then the lam, and then continue the lam directly into the ra, despite the fact that he's presumably intending later to add in this line to then add the consonant here. So I think it needs not to be overstated exactly why this is suspicious, right? Because this form aleph, and then you write the lam ra, you can very easily come in 100 years later, 50 years later, 20 years later, and add this line on top, and then just say, yeah, that was a consonant before the ra. So I think that there's something very fishy about this, and also you can see the original inking of this over here for the ba. However, for the ya, there is no bleed over, as in you don't see the original inking behind it. So these are just points to note, and things to note also when you're looking at manuscripts yourself. You can very often see these kinds of susnesses. But however, not to bear down too much about this turab word, it is interesting just also to note that the name in the traditions for the Ali character is Ali Abu Turab. Correct me if I'm wrong, JC.
Abu Turab, yes.
Abu Turab, exactly. So this, which is rendered traditionally as something like father of dust, which is then read. There's like apparently a story about how Ali fell into dust or something, and then Muhammad like playfully named him father of dust or some kind of story like this. But again, like I said, I'm not that interested what people 200, 300, 400 years later write about this imagined history. So I don't care about the text. So this is something that I want to put forward just as a tentative possibility, hypothetically, that we're dealing with is al-rab, where we have the T is forgotten because it looks suspicious. This is not a concrete methodology, and also I'm going to show just in a second if we don't make this assumption. But just bear with me for a second. If we do make this assumption, where basically this supposed Y is itself not meant to be just in the text, just like this is not meant to be, then we would have the Lord, which would then render the sentence as gushing forth from a liquid from between the cross and the Lord, which already paints this image in our minds. But we don't have to go there necessarily right away. Before we continue, here's just worth noting, you're going to see this very often when you're looking through manuscripts. It's like these alifs are just so clearly not written by the same scribe who wrote these alifs. You can tell. It's just, the alifs are nice, proper, spaced, and so forth, but then all of a sudden you get these like squished in alifs that are written a lot sloppier and don't have themselves a bleed behind them. What I mean by that is you can see in this alif, for example, you have the baseline, the original inking, and then you have this later inking, but you can see both. So this is attested for sure in the original inking. That's just to explain what I mean there. But so we're looking at this word. So this is what the Corpus Quran website. It does the same function where I'm looking basically at how this word is generally translated throughout all of its attestations, the root in question. And the root, the way it's usually used, and you can see it very, very consistently with the noun, well, except for the verse that we're looking at, right? Everywhere else it means dust, except for the verse we're looking at where it means ribs. The same way everywhere in the other word it means crucify, except when we're looking at it when it means backbone. So you can just already smell it. It's like, come on, guys, you're not being that sneaky, eh? Anyway, so this is the question mark word now. So we have already rendered this other word tentatively as the cross, and now the question is between the cross and what? We're created from something that comes from between the cross and something. So this is one thing that I would propose as being a very good contender. This is terba. I guess it would be pronounced terba in the Eastern phonetic, and it means fat. It's a very, like a proper name, it just means fat as such. However, it also takes upon religious connotations and religious meanings that are often foreign to us because we have potentially Christian culture, but we don't have the ancient Hebrew sacrificial system culture as our sort of baseline knowledge. Where in which fat takes on a symbolic meaning. So I'll read a couple of verses here to establish the context of what I'm going to present. We read in 1 Peter 1 from verses 18 to 19 as well as 23 as well. Verse 23 we read, "You were ransomed with the precious blood of Christ. You have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God." And we see this juxtaposition hence of blood and being born again, where in the same passage it creates a theological link. Christ's blood ransoms, and the result is the new birth. This is then even further emphasized also in different language in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 17 and 21. We read, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation." So not just this idea of a new birth necessarily only, but also explicitly language of to be a new creation, right? So if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. So that in him we might become the righteousness of God through Christ as our representative. And reading also further here, we specifically about this question of blood on the altar. So we read in Leviticus 17:11, we read, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for you, for your souls." And it centralizes the altar. So we have basically the altar, you have the flesh, you have the blood, but also crucially, you have the fat. And we'll see that just now. So we read, "And the priests, Aaron's son, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar." So the question of this, the blood is important. The position of the blood is important. It has to be put on the sides of the altar, sometimes also on the head of the altar, on the horns of the altar. And so this is emphasized and it's important in the Levitical laws or the ritual laws. And then when it comes to the question of fat, it's also involved in, of course, the book of Leviticus here. We read in Leviticus 3, verses 3 to 5, he shall offer from the sacrifice of peace offering an offering made by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails. Then Aaron's sons shall burn it on the top of the altar, or on the altar on top of the burnt offering, which is on the wood on the fire. It is food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So the fat, which is understood as being this the fat, like we understand in English, around the organs, which was the most nutrient and energy dense part of the animal. So obviously the idea was that you sacrifice not what you do not value, but you sacrifice what you do value. So therefore the delicacy, the most important energy rich part of the animal, was to be burnt, not consumed by the priest, but to be burnt as it was reserved strictly for God, is the idea in the Old Testament. So we have these three components. We have the altar, we have the blood, and we have the fat. The fat is reserved strictly for God and not consumed by anyone. The blood is ritually applied to the altar in a certain format, and the flesh is sometimes consumed by the priest or who offered it up. But the fat is never presumed or consumed because it's God's portions. So we have these three elements here. I would put forward that we have the element of the cross, which or the altar, let's say, right? Then we have the fat, that which is burnt and offered directly to God, and we have the blood, which is put in a sense sort of layered in relation to the altar and the fat. And the blood hence would be that which is between the cross and the fat on the crucifixion. So this is how I would render it essentially. So taking into account the rendering I put forward before about min ma, instead of being talking about from water spurred, it's talking and saying from what spurred. So therefore we take away this hyper focus on water as such, but rather it's talking about a liquid as such by the lack of specificity. So he was created, humans, from what spurred going out between the cross and the fat. Surely he, by implication, he would now with our new rendering refer to the most proximal noun, which would be talking and referring to the fat. The thing is, we're not just talking about any fat because we're in the context of the cross. So obviously the fat we're speaking of would be the delicacy, the part that's only reserved for God of Christ. So you have the fat, it's like the sacrificially loaded language of the fat and the cross, and what's between them is the wound, and the wound spurts forth blood. And we were hence created from that which spurred forth from this scenery. And therefore, when we read in verse 8, as it continues, and it says, surely he is over his returning indeed a determiner, it becomes clear as day what we're looking at here, where he is referring to the fat, which is Christ, and therefore he is he's a determiner over his returning. So obviously, that would be a reference to the second coming. Otherwise, in the traditional rendering, the he would have to refer to the last used he, which is referring to mankind or man as such. So therefore, if we don't have this re-rendering where fat takes on this meaning of duality between, fat as such, the sacrificial fat, the specific sacrificial fat that was on the cross being Christ, and therefore he, being Christ, is over his returning a determiner. The day when the truth is befallen and so forth, we can go into detail in those other verses some other time. For now, we're focusing on this question of, did we get created from a liquid or water that spurred forth between the backbone and the ribs? Or is it quite a deep visual and New Testament based image? As we were looking before at the verses about, newborn, new creation in Christ, it would make sense if we are actually, truly, according to the New Testament, born again. We are created anew. We are ransomed through the blood of Christ. It would make entirely theological sense for an author in the 7th century to be writing, he was created from what spurred out between the cross and the fat of the sacrifice. Surely he, that fat, is over his returning, second coming, indeed a determiner. So that's what I would put forward, that we're looking at instead of the root being rendered everywhere in the text as being crucify, and then suddenly being rendered as your loins in one instance, and the backbone in another instance, that instead we should be rendering them as cross. In the case of 423, your cross, because of the cum suffix, and in the case of 86, where we have the most clear, simple form of the triradical root, as well as the definite article, they make it, in a very simple sense, should be understood as the cross, which would then create this image for us instead. Wait a moment. Where we get this image for us of two options. Either we're going with the left interpretation, which is what all the Tafsir writers effectively, in one form or another, affirm. This idea that this is talking about some kind of reality that is true and real, that we really are created from some kind of liquid. Presumably, these people in the past centuries would affirm that this is talking maybe about the location where sperm is produced, and it probably evolves every century. You get a new interpretation in some form or another, a slight variation, but you're still stuck with the fact that the text, according to that interpretation, is saying something about two different kinds of bones and human beings coming forth from some liquid between the two, which is absurd. So either you have that, or you have, quite frankly, this really beautiful imagery and totally New Testament attested theological position of all of creation uh, coming forth or being created from, as believers, from the blood of Christ, right? Not that everyone, but we were created, the human. So there's some nuance there that maybe the author is saying that even the non-believers or the believers, not totally sure on the details there. However, it seems to me that we either have the silly rendering or we have the profoundly deep Syriac rendering. So I hope I did a decent job there. JC, is there anything that was a little vague, or do you have any other questions or comments?
I think it's been wonderful, and I have really actually liked this expose because, well, first of all, I'd like to tell people watching that this is not like the last thing that we're showing. We have like lots and lots of other stuff that either we have finalized or that we're working on. So make sure that you are subscribed so that you get notified when we are having the next shows, that you like the streams. That would help us a lot. And if you have the opportunity to share to anyone who is interested in understanding what the Quran really was, that if you can do that, it would really help us. Then, apart from that, and about this specific topic, when we think about it and we see that for 1400 years, it's more like 1200, but let's say 1400 years, people have been reading this in the Quran and they have been convinced that they have to parrot those words, even though they knew it was false. Because nobody thought that humans are created between the backbone and the ribs or anything of the sort. So we've had people for 1400 years having to say something that they know full well it doesn't make any sense, simply because it comes in a book that they've told them this comes from God. And if you say that it isn't, or if you don't believe in a single thing, you're not a kuffar. And look around, look how we are treating the non-Muslims. So it's quite heavy. Now, the explanation that is there in the traditions and so on, we can see even when they get confused, and some of them they say this is backbones, the other one ribs, sorry, the other one loins. The whole thing is confused. They want to make it make sense, even through the translations, and they fail epically because they are already reading what it says there with the diacritics. So the question then is, why would they write something that silly? Why would they add the diacritics in a way that shows very clearly that the book is not making any sense? There is only one reason why they would do that. It's not because they couldn't understand what it was written, but because they wanted to disguise what it was written. If what it was written was perfectly acceptable, based on the theology that they were already creating for the previous 200 years, it's fine. They would just keep what it is. They put the dots in the right places and everyone is happy. But when we look at something that would be talking about the cross, crucifixion, Jesus, these sort of things, that's when they have to disguise it. And they cannot just burn all of the books, because at that point, this book has been circulating for hundreds of years. That would be a big problem. So all that they can do at that point is add hamzas, alifs, dots, and come up with something. And it has to be anything it's really anything, providing that it doesn't show that it's about Jesus or about the cross or resurrection or anything like that. It doesn't really matter what it ends up being, like in this case, backbone and ribs. And when we are going through the Quran and see things that are very silly, we know there is something hidden. And when we dig a little bit, normally what we find is all about a weird Christological view. And yes, as well, to remind everyone that these shows are not a one-off. This actually is compounded with everything that we've discussed before. We've discussed words like Furqan, al-Rahman, Jesus all throughout the book. And what we're showing is that the Quran was very Trinitarian, uh, heretical, but still Trinitarian. For need of a better word, it would be more on the side of Christianity than anything else. And they have just changed the meaning of everything that is in there. So this shows is about showing other things that make absolutely no sense in the Arabic as it is now because of the dots. But when we just dig a little bit, we actually find the original meaning or something that could be the original meaning. This one, particularly with the word cross, I think that one is pretty much now set. Everywhere in the book is talking about that word as crucifixion again and again. So this one has to be about the cross. It has to be about the crucifixion. Now, the one about the ribs, we have that problem that is normally rendered as dust. Maybe it was a different word. So if people watching are interested in this sort of research, and then they go and they find out that, hey, maybe there is a word in Hebrew or in Ge'ez, which we haven't checked, and it actually makes even more sense. That's great. We are not coming up with final answers. We are finding the problems and then providing answers. So if people watching find an ultimate answer about something that we are just, putting it tentatively out there, let us know, and then we can update the record and we do other sessions saying, hey, this person has found the solution about this specific word, and this is now the full rendering. So this is not meant to be just about Cash and I trying to figure out what the book says, but everybody out there. There are lots of people that have been as well contacting us because they are interested in finding out what the Quran says, and they are doing their own research. And now we are talking with them about these things. So if you are one of those people, make sure that, well, you get investigating and let us know when you find things that are really, really cool. And for this session, Cash, very well done. I think the crucifixion thing certainly is the only thing that makes sense because it's attested everywhere in the Quran. And the other word, maybe a 50-50, but still it shows very clearly that it's talking about something to do with Jesus and then immediately about the second coming. So that explains, or at least clarifies, that one verse that has not made sense for 1400 years is because they tried to hide the original meaning. So well done.
Yeah, and to piggyback off what you're saying regarding these very peculiar, could be seen as embarrassing, at the very least, they're silly. These types of verses where almost inevitably, this is the pattern I've come across so far in my work, is that the sillier the standard Islamic narrative translation, the more clearly Christological the original rendering was. And the reason, which you can imagine why, is that if you have a situation where you need the text not to talk about the cross, not to talk about Christ, then you'll go to even more drastic means to make way for the corruption, right? You'll be more desperate to make it happen, and therefore you're going to go even to larger extents and be more brazen in your corruption of the original intention of the author. So that's very much a reality, and I think we see it in this example. So in regards to like what you were saying about us continuing, we're going to continue to do this until we figure out all of this out, right? So we'll do a video like this one, where we eventually also look at the Turab word to get a more concrete rendering, to, for example, look exhaustively at all the usages. However, we haven't done that so far. We'll do that eventually, as well as all kinds of other topics that we have loaded up. The next one we're looking at is this idea of Subhi, which is related to the Sabians and so forth. Well, it's not really related to them, but you'll see that in the episode. Um, it's we think related to something about baptism. Well, we think, well, we kind of know. So that's going to be a pretty fun topic for the next maybe the next stream or the one after. We'll see. And yeah, I thought this was a great stream.
Yeah, great. So, and we're now still sticking between 45 minutes and an hour, which is great. No more marathons, at least not for the time being. So, uh, Kash, any final words before we let everybody go? Kash, any final words? I think Kash is gone.
No, I was
Ah,
muted. No. Is there any comments, or we unfortunately didn't get too many live viewers to go through?
no, we didn't have any actual questions like directly on the topic that we could actually address. So,
Okay,
and that will probably be the case when we're having very, very short questions, very
right.
short streams. So, cool. Anything else, Kash?
No, that's it. Thank you everyone for the attention and the support and comments. We appreciate it a lot. And we hope to see all of you as well in the next stream, which will be Thursday at the same time as today.
Right. So that's this Thursday. So until then, God bless you all. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.